All right, I'm going to resume the recording and we will go ahead and get started. I will continue to let people in as they arrive. As always, we sent out the agenda and immediately had some changes. I did love that I literally got to type into an email today per my email of 25 seconds ago. Here is the attachment I did not attach. I've been both giggling and mortified ever since sending that out, but appreciate it. Becky has, because this is our last session, our last seventh grade giant session for the year, Becky has some reminders and stuff for those of you who are going after the sketches, the SCECHs, the skeeches, whatever you call them. They're all the same thing in our world. So she's got some stuff to go over regarding that. But she also has children who have after school obligations, and she's currently in charge of the carpool. So she will be here a little bit later to give some of those important updates that we would normally give at the 4:30 to 4:40 time. So I'm going to launch us first into a Unit 6 overview. And then I'm going to turn it over to Phil for a good chunk of time for our philosophy of the unit for the evening. We'll take a little break. We'll come back. We will talk a little bit about some of the things that Phil isn't going to cover in Unit 6. I will cover the Unit 6 assessment because that is very different than the Unit 7 assessment. We'll then do Unit 7 overview, and whatever time we end tonight is the time that we end. So if that is right at 7:30, perfect. If that is not at 7:30, if that is before 7:30, perfect. It will not be at 7:31 though. We will respect your time and call time for sure at 7:30 exactly, if not before. So it's kind of the overview for the evening. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Now, one thing to note is that people are in the waiting room. There we go. One thing to note is that with Unit 6 and Unit 7, if you're ready to teach these tomorrow, when you go into Unit 6, and you pull this up, you can see the very first thing, the Unit 6 compelling and supporting question posters. They are not linked yet. That is the posters that people would either put up in their classroom or print off or display digitally. Those are PDFs that I make just out of a PowerPoint slide, and they are the lowest priority in my production list because they are literally just the same questions that are printed in your unit. So if you are ready to start Unit 6 tomorrow, you have my most sincere apologies that I don't have the compelling and supporting question posters up. Like I was telling Phil, I ended up scheduling all day and all night PD all week this week. And last week was spent preparing for that. So I was unable to get those done. But most of the rest of the unit is linked and ready to go. So our Unit 6 overview, our compelling question, why did trade networks get bigger over time? Starts off with this supporting question, what inventions made trade grow? So we will have, with this particular one, we talk a lot about trade. And we were even able to, you'll notice there's some stuff in here that popped up yesterday, if you've been looking at these units over time, to get a lay of where we're headed. We added some stuff just yesterday on Russia in particular, not just because it was relevant in terms of the historical content, but also relevant in terms of current events. It gives you an entry point because there are some big things going on in the world right now as we are recording this particular one that you may want to have a path towards potentially discussing with your ancient world history kids. And so Phil in particular thought it would be a good idea to create that off ramp for you out of the ancient world and into what's going on right now between Russia and the Ukraine. I will also tell you that there's some stuff being added from a modern day perspective to the 6th grade course. I know Carol at our meeting a couple of weeks ago said that she was going to be adding some stuff there for that. So if you're looking for some more materials on that, I would also suggest going back and looking at what is going to go into 6th grade. I can't tell you where exactly right now, though I will try to do some mining during the philosophy part to see where they were going with it. But we at least wanted to provide you a point that would logically next steps allow you to talk about a current event in a class that is generally speaking a ancient world history course. So that is also in lesson 1. And, Phil's going to go into more detail on some of that stuff. So this whole unit, like I said, though, the compelling question, why did trade networks get bigger over time? This is how we tackle what Phil and I call the dumbest set of K-12 academic standards that have ever been assembled by a state. We have a very coherent story that is told by our 7th grade ancient world history standards. It all falls apart when we get to the 4s, the 411, the 412, and the 413. And what I mean by that is we had an opportunity to continue to tell said coherent narrative of world history. And instead, the groups that were responsible for writing the 7th grade standards just kind of went with these hodgepodge standards. And to make matters worse, there are also some random standalone civic standards and some random standalone geography standards and some random standalone economic standards that just really do not make a great deal of sense in what is essentially an ancient world history course. They also exist in the 6th grade, which is a much more natural fit for a lot of those. But because they were standards in the Michigan Standards document, and this is a curriculum project centered around them, it was our job to figure out some ways to tackle them. We knock some of that out of the park with these final 2 units, and some of them we are just doing what is required of us by those content expectations. So just know that we're still doing our best to tell the story with these 2 final, or at least with this unit. The final unit is a bunch of mini capstones, but in some ways we were limited by what the standards say. And so this was our best attempt at cracking that particular nut. So overall, Unit 6 is going to be the conclusion of the story for you, and Unit 7 is a bunch of reviews and capstones, and we tackle those in 2 different ways. But I will save my narrative on what we do with Unit 7 for when we get to Unit 7. But that is my bird's eye flyby view of Unit 6. And before I stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Phil, I am wondering if anyone has any questions about my little flyby overview of Unit 6. I practiced my wait time of 3 deep breaths and I heard nothing, which should have been enough time for anyone to unmute if they had them. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Phil. And Phil, they're all yours.
Well, okay. So let me share the screen here. As Dave said, we took a look at the Glicks and wondered exactly whether anybody was planning anything when they put them in the order that they did. It's like there's 1,000 years of history and they just kind of grabbed some individual items out of there. And that's a kind of a shame, because the roots of so many of our modern world problems, not just what's going on in Ukraine right now, but the fact of a pandemic and all of that, a lot of that comes out of this era. And I have to admit that I have a sort of a predisposition to like the story of the Vikings for a variety of reasons, not least of which is I taught 25 years at the University of Minnesota, and therefore the Minnesota Viking Stadium was about 3 blocks from my apartment building next to the U. The Vikings are an intriguing part of the story for a whole lot of reasons that have almost nothing to do with what most people think about the Vikings. To begin with, they weren't the Vikings, they were the Norse. And Viking was a verb at the time. Viking meant to go to another country to trade or quietly acquire some of the things that were over there and bring them back. And so it lets us talk about the fact that all the way through history, the line between traders and raiders was extremely thin and very blurry. And that's part of this story. But another big part of the story is trying to put them into context as to why that became a way of life that was reasonably profitable for about a 500-year period in history at a particular time. So that's the background for the story about how the Norse became the Vikings and what we can learn by trying to put that story into context. I should probably say for every single one of these activities that we have for this unit 4, for this era 4, for every one of these activities, it's probably important to start out by telling the students that we're not trying to memorize all the little details of what's going on in the story. We're trying to take a look at the story and then generalize out of it a principle that we can pull into the present day context. Because the world is just getting more complicated as we move into era 4. We don't just have 3 empires or 4 empires. We've got about 15 of them at different times. And you just can't do the same level of detail for that as you did for the Egyptians. Now, my quiet answer for that is just to say less about the Egyptians and get on with some of the more interesting stories. Let me tell you what I mean by an interesting story. You had these Norse people about the year 750. They were living up on these cold peninsulas up here. This is a good place to stop and say, Europe is really different than any other part of the world because Europe is a subcontinent, a big peninsula made out of a whole lot of little peninsulas. And the fact of a peninsula turned out to be awfully important in the history. Because, and so that we come up here and we put a definition card. A peninsula is geologically, it's a finger of land sticking out into a body of water. It's a piece of land surrounded on 3 sides by water. It's the opposite of a bay. But the second definition of a peninsula, it's an area that is very easy to defend against an army because the army can come from only one direction. So a place like Greece was easy to defend because there could be a thing called Thermopylae on it. A place like Ukraine is awfully hard to defend because you can attack it from practically any direction, as we see happening right now. So there's activity right away. And it's one of these that you can hand out to the students. You can do it on the clickable maps, or you can do it as a demonstration here. But there were a bunch of peninsulas that were very important in history at different times, starting with Greece and then going through the Roman Empire, Iberia, or Spain and Portugal together, Scandinavia, which is the story we're on today, Jutland, the particular part of Scandinavia that was important as a homeland of the Norse, and then a bunch of little peninsulas with names that resonate through history: Cornwall, Brittany, Normandy. Scotland's a peninsula, and that allowed it to defend itself against attacks from all directions, literally. And nowadays, the Kola Peninsula, the reason for the Russo-Finnish War was to capture that peninsula and the submarine base that they got up along with it. So the question that we've got, the compelling question, is what made the people who lived on these peninsulas suddenly become such an important part of history for about 200 years? And part of that story is the effect of inventions. A transportation invention helped them rise, and a construction invention led to their demise. But another part of the story, because no historic story tends to be simple all by itself, is the effect of some climate changes. Now, this is a global average temperature over time, and we've shown you this graph once earlier. We're going to home in on about the year 800. The Earth became warmer. Now, for people in Michigan, what does that mean? We have an extremely detailed record of temperatures in Denmark. It's a combination of cave sediments, lake sediments, tree rings, and so on. And the average frost-free season in the year 800 was about 105 days. By the year 1000, 200 years later, the frost-free season was about 170 days long. Now, why is that important? Is it takes about 140 days to grow a good crop of grain, corn, wheat, and so on. And that's the frost-free season in central Michigan, roughly around Mount Pleasant, Central Michigan University. In other words, the climate of Northland, the home of these people, changed from being like the UP to being like Northern Indiana in about 200 years. Chance of crop failure was 1 out of every 3 years in the year 800, and it was 1 out of 20 years later. But people didn't change their behavior. They were still making little babies on the assumption that they were going to lose maybe 2 out of 3 of them to starvation, which is what life was like in Northern Europe throughout most of the period of time from the Roman Empire up until about 800. You basically, could not raise a family safely. You just had too tough a time in terms of the climate that was there. And then it became very favorable, but people were still making these babies, and pretty soon the Norse population just outgrew its peninsulas, and people started to go Viking. The Norse homeland, when it became much more productive like that, as their population increased, they began to spread out to new lands. Within 50 years, they'd gone all the way up the coast of Norway and started to go into Europe and began to do their Viking raids over in England, in northern Spain, even in parts of the Mediterranean. That spread was aided by the invention of the longship. That ship can carry about 30 soldiers and float in just 2 feet of water, which means that it can travel on shallow rivers and lakes as well as deep oceans. And with that ship, the Norse visited river towns all over Europe. Now, this is a map activity for your kids. I mean, they can actually draw where were the Vikings at a particular time in history. By the year 1050, they'd gone as far as Spain, Rome, Moscow, Constantinople, Afghanistan, even North America. By that time, however, the people of Europe had begun to learn how do you resist a raiding population more effectively. And one invention was a particularly effective way to defeat a raiding army. Just build your city walls high enough that you can live inside them for a couple months while the people outside starve. At the same time, however, the climate also started to get colder, and Northern Europe as a whole started to have crop failures and famines. That also set the stage for the plague a little bit later because people were weakened by those famines over that period of time from 12 to 1300. So the story that you've got has 2 separate activities, a clickable map, and this PowerPoint is that a warming climate and an invention gave a group of people a unique advantage at a particular time in history. And a cooling climate and another invention greatly reduced that advantage about 200 years later. That basically is the story. If you want to read more about it, give you a couple websites to take a look at. But it's like, there is a story that you've got a half dozen different ways to show. Now, that's just one of the stories. We could have tried to make a similar PowerPoint for the Mongols and the Ottomans and the Ming and all of the other peoples that populate this era 4. But you can't just show a PowerPoint day after day after day to people. So we've got a bunch of different ways to present some of the other stories. And we give you some links to PowerPoints that do exist there. So what I'm going to do is kind of turn the usual outline on its ear a little bit and go through the summary of these just to hint at what some of these, different activities look like. This particular PowerPoint is up available for you. And it is that list that you've got. So let me punch the button to start that from the beginning. So There is a handout, the very first of your set of handouts. And if you did download the handouts, you might want to have them available to look at, but I'll try to put them on the screen big enough that they're easy to see. Just relax and see how the students can use these different maps and diagrams. And I'm going to stop it somewhere about in the middle when we talk about the links to Ukraine and see if we can come up with some ideas there. So if you have not yet used the Belaton shipwreck activity, that would also fit right into the middle of this era here. Remember, that's the one where you circle all the places where particular bowls and particular pots and things like that that were found on this shipwreck here. And when you do that, you get a pretty good idea of what the trade routes in the Eastern Hemisphere were like. Now here, I've got to stop for a second for a mechanical thing. There've been a couple people that have written me emails saying that when they take a look at that and they click on that link in the margins, it doesn't work for them. And the answer is, when I make my next $2 billion and I can go toe to toe against Google and Microsoft, we might be able to anticipate when Google decides to change their security rules. In the meantime, what we did was take all those clickable maps and put them on Dave's website, textbooks, wmisd.org/ and then it's big clickable maps. All right, anyway, we make other links to those. But this particular clickable map is up on that WMISD website. Yeah. That was one of the activities. I've just shown you the Norse-going Viking, but I didn't show you that there's a printed peninsula activity that if you didn't want to do that as a presentation, you could give this as an individual or a small group activity or even a take-home activity. It's a good way to review some of the earlier eras of history because the peninsulas of Greece and Rome and Iberia and so on played a role in those things. This peninsulas are also on the Europe clickable map that's up on the textbooks WMISD website. And you can go through that clickable map. You can turn the list of names off and have a quiz out of it or put the names up on there. You notice that the whole Viking story is also on that clickable map. So you don't have to use the PowerPoint if you don't want. And that map that I showed you in the PowerPoint is also a printed activity that the students can take their magic markers and draw a dark blue line around where the Vikings started and then shade in the areas that they expanded with a little bit lighter blue. And then when they expanded a little bit further, it's still lighter blue. And they get a kind of a map of the Viking expansion. The objective here is to see how inventions and climate changes work together at a particular moment in history to help a group of people become the Vikings. While the Vikings were doing their thing in Northern Europe, the spice trade was really ramping up around India, Indonesia, Arabia, and eventually Europe, Southern Europe plugged itself into that. That's a good reason why Venice became such an important city, because it was a linchpin in that spice trade. Question is, how do you tell the story of the spice trade? And one possibility is just to show the students all of the plants that people have grown and sold as part of the spice trade. I'm reading a book right now that's just called The Spice Trail, the Pepper Trail. There's a lot of books out there. There's a lot of short articles about spices, and we decided there was enough stuff out there that all we needed to do was kind of give you a way to bring it all together to say, these are the things that made people want to make long distance travel. And there's a reason for that, good geographic reason. Spices are light and valuable, which means you can make a lot of money trading them. Things like sand and gravel and bricks and iron and so on. really you can't make any money trading yet until after we've invented better ships and railroads and other ways to move heavy things from one place to another. So for better or worse, spices drove world trade throughout most of this era 4. And a list of pepper plants can serve as a teaser to help students see how many different places would be pulled into these trade networks because of what they were producing. There is a clickable map up on the WMISD website that's about, there's a clickable map, and one set of them are the groups of the trade realms. Now, these are the trade realms that the high school world geography class wanted to have as part of this clickable map. And what it basically shows is that there were 6 different networks in the Middle Ages here. I've clicked on 4 of them. The Viking trade network, which went, from over to Greenland and then most of Northern Europe and reached all the way over into the Afghanistan, Ukraine area like that. There was a Silk Road network. There was a spice trade network down here, and then there was the Ming Chinese network over here, with a couple places where these networks overlap.
Hey, Phil,
You know,
do you have that up on your screen right now? Because what I'm seeing is the copyright 2018 Phil Gershmal slide. So you may need to share your screen again if you are sharing those clickables right now.
I'm not sharing the clickables. I'm
Okay.
just sharing the PowerPoint.
Okay. The slide that is on my screen, and maybe it's just mine, but the slide that's on my screen right now is just the copyright 2018 Phil Gershmal, teachers who saw this presentation, yada, yada, yada.
Oh, man. For all this period of time?
For it, yep, correct.
Ugly, 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 ugly.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. So maybe stop the screen share and do a full share the full screen of that particular desktop. Sorry.
Okay. Stop.
There you go.
Start sharing. And
there we go. I should have broken in sooner. I apologize for that, everybody, and especially Phil. I should have broken in sooner. I just didn't realize until you started saying I turned those layers on that we were definitely, yep, there we go.
okay. Well, let me in 14 seconds, then wander back over the, well, make sure that when we start this one up, it actually comes up, all right? So now you've got the handout list?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And we mentioned the Peloton Shipwreck as an activity you could do now, and it would help you set up these networks here. You notice that the ship network is separate from the land-based network, and that becomes a little bit more prominent in those other ones. I had gone over the Norse-going Vikings, but I mentioned that there's a printed activity about the peninsulas, there's a clickable map about the peninsulas, and that same clickable map about Europe has got all the layers about the Vikings, and you can compare where they were relative to the Roman Empire and Greek Empire and so on. And we've got the presentation that I showed. And then I had the list of the spices with their origins on them, and the simplified version of that network, that you had a Viking trade network, you had a Silk Road trade network, you have the Arab Muslim mediated spice trade network, which connected Southern Europe, particularly Venice and parts of Greece, together with East Africa, India, Indonesia. That was a very active network. There are reports of fleets of 500 ships. Now remember, ships at that time were much, much smaller than they were later on. And there was a separate Ming Chinese network that just overlapped a little bit going over to India in order to get pepper and things like that. The reason to go into these networks is that they become the stage for the Mongols, the bubonic plagues, the rise of the Ottomans, and eventually the European age of exploration. The goal of Vasco da Gama and all these characters out of Spain and Portugal was to find a way to get into the spice trade where you didn't have to pay an Arab middleman half of the value of the product in order to cross their land. So going into these networks is an important background step for understanding things like the Mongols and the plague. So then we get to the Mongols. The question is, what do you say about the Mongols other than it was the world's biggest empire by far? Remember the empire's activity that you did back in Era 3. And one of the options was the Mongol, even though it didn't fit in Era 3, to realize that it was about the size of the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty, and the Mughals all put together. The question is, how could that have spread so far and so fast? And the answer is partly because there was a Silk Road trading network that they were the intermediaries of. Like I say, there's a lot of maps, videos, and so on. When I went through my collection of these maps, I found this one that I thought was kind of cool to put into this PowerPoint for you. You notice it's in Russian. This is actually a map from a Russian textbook about the expansion of the Mongols. And you notice they started out in this little patch of land here, east of Lake Baikal. And then after about 50 years, they had spread down into China and all the way over to the Caspian Sea. Their next move was all the way into Southern Europe. And then they attacked from the south, going north, into the Norse lands, the areas of the Norse, the Vikings, and the Russians. It's a kind of an interesting map there because it ties in to a timeline that we gave you. As Dave said earlier, the roots of some of the Ukrainian crisis are actually on that Russian map that you see there. The fact that Russia is shown in this little green patch surrounded by the Mongols that controlled the peak area on that map. So we put together a timeline of Moscow history. And it's a very simple activity. You tell your students to read it over and to circle all the times when somebody attacked Moscow and either burned it to the ground or killed everybody or did some other terrible thing to those people. That's the list right there. Moscow as a city lost more than a third of its population 17 separate times between the time of the Mongols that burned the town down completely and killed all of the inhabitants who didn't run away. That's a strategy that's being used right now. So I'd have to say, Vladimir Putin would make a very good Mongol, and leave it at that for right. But if you take a look at this, and let me be real clear here, Putin is indeed a murdering thug, but it takes some understanding of medieval Russian history to help us see why the Russian people are willing to buy that kind of propaganda, that we are surrounded by enemies, that the West is going to attack us. Because the fact about Moscow is that it's in the middle of a big flat plain and it was very easy to attack. In other words, it was almost a textbook non-peninsula. It could be attacked from any direction relatively easily, and in fact was attacked from many directions relatively easily over its time. That is a part of the Russian psychology. And it gives you a way to get into a discussion of what's going on right now and what people in China or Europe and so on could or could not say to help alleviate some of the problems that are there. So that's another story. The travels of Ibn Battuta is still another story. A lot of students will get a reading about Marco Polo, who was a good long distance traveler. But Ibn Battuta actually traveled something like 6.5 times as far. And he left a complete diary describing his travels. It fills 3 volumes. And so we wandered through that and we made a map activity out of it. The map activity is not just about the travels of Ibn Battuta, it's also a summary of a lot of the important places in history, places like Samarkand, places like Crimea, places like Constantinople or Gibraltar. And he visited all of these places. Now, this kind of activity can be easily viewed as just pure busy work. Unless you do what my dad did with an activity that he was teaching 7th grade, he would make a game out of an activity like this. He would organize the students into groups of 2 to 4, and then tell them each of your groups should have one person who reads a line from the travels of Ibn Battuta. And you should have one that looking at the map and somebody that's marking the map. And then you have to rotate after you've done about a third of them so that everybody has to read their fair share. And you have to read all the names, not just the letters. And then it's like ready, set, go. See how fast you can get it done. When I did it with a group of 7th graders, even though the list takes an entire page, it took them just about 4.25 minutes to do it. And when they do it, they will realize how Pax Mongolica, the safety provided by Mongol rule over most of Eurasia, allowed very safe long distance travel. And you can review the names and general locations of a lot of historic places. Oh, and by the way, it's when the Mongols reopened the Silk Road that the bugs that cause plague were allowed to travel along with the traders. And that's how the bubonic plague, the pest, Yersinia pestis, how it traveled from China to Europe in the 1300s. So the stories are connected with each other. And what you want to emphasize for the students is the connections between the stories, not just the individual facts of the stories. In fact, the facts of the stories can be found fairly easily. So there's a geohistogram activity about trading terms that connects this Mongol invasion and then the New Silk Road and then the spread of the plague. A somewhat more questionable story is about the women of the Ottoman harem. And as it says in the center column of your Giants online website, the Ottoman harem is a much misunderstood institution. People have images that range all the way from nonstop sex orgies to a kind of a monastery nunnery type operation. It's a complicated story. There is a geographic component that we made into a map activity because all of the red dots on that map that you're looking at up there are the birthplaces, the places where the wives of the Ottoman sultans grew up. And you can see that the sultans were obtaining their wives, not just for romantic reasons, but for diplomatic reasons. They were ratifying trade agreements. They were ratifying treaties. And the Ottoman wives underline the character of the Ottoman Empire, which leads us up into the next activity. So the whole point of this one is it shows how the Ottomans prospered by being a very conscious middleman between Asian and Mediterranean trade networks and cementing those trade relationships through Sultan marriage. And that the Ottoman harems were actually an international discussion group as much as any other thing. then when we did this over in Macomb County last year, one of the teachers who was in the group there said, you know, we need some kind of a way to summarize some of these different empires and dynasties and so on that's happening during this era. So we put together an activity about that. If you take a look at the simple geohistogram and you just look at that era 4, particularly the part of era 4 that is after the Mongols, you can see that the Ottoman, the Mughal, and the Ming control a good part of that territory up until the time that Europe started to send its ships overseas. Now, this is roughly at the time of the Reformation in Europe. And then after the Reformation, the age of colonization began through these European ships. So what is it about the Ottoman, the Ming, and the Mughals? And we said, let's just make an activity about comparing that. Now, filling in a matrix is not one of the highest points of any student's career. So we try to figure out a way to make it fairly fast, rather than having them chase up the answers through the textbooks and so on. We put all the answers together in a column on the right-hand side. And their job is just try to figure out which one matches up with which other one. They could use the geohistogram, they can use the timelines. There are a bunch of different ways to do this. And one way you can make this a little bit more interesting is to say that one of our goals is to pick a spirit animal, some kind of animal that captures the nature of each of these individual empires. The teacher's guide that goes along with it says that the Mughal Empire was really like a turtle. It was sitting down there in South Asia, very well protected by that shell of mountains and deserts that's around India. So it could venture forth into the trade networks, but at any point that it was threatened, it could retreat back, and it basically acted kind of like a little turtle. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were acting like an octopus. They were stretching their tentacles out in every which direction and marrying off the children of different diplomats or rulers in different places. In any case, thinking about that gives you a shorthand way to kind of capture the essence of empires that are very different, even though they were at the same time period. Now, I'm not going to try to explain that any further than that. We knew this was going to be a little bit tricky, so we wrote a big, long section on the website, and you can read that over. It will give you more than enough information. And then there's about 4 different versions of this with different numbers of things pre-filled in. So you can have a complicated version or a simple version. Lots of different ways to do that. The capitals of the African empires, that's lesson 3. And that's actually something that's best done with a clickable map. So I'm just going to do it with a clickable map in a little while. There is a printed activity that goes along with it. It shows a frame out of the clickable map, and then it's got a bunch of questions for them. And that's all I'm going to say about that right now. I'll do the clickable map in a little while. And then finally, we've got all these things happening in Eurasia, but there was stuff happening in the Americas at the same time. And whoever wrote your Glicks said that you ought to do something about the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayas, or not just one, but 4 of the Glicks. So we'll do something about the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayas for 4 of the Glicks. Are you waving at me, Dave?
No, not at all. You are just fine. Although since we did break, I will say I love with the Ottoman harems thing how you mentioned nonstop sex orgies, like you were just rattling off a bake sale event in the school announcements, and then you just moved right on like nothing else happened. That was one of the more humorous aspects of the evening. Now on to the Aztecs.
Yeah, so the usual summary at the end. these map activities are not designed to replace the lessons you're already doing about the Vikings, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas, and so on. They're to give you maps that you can put them into perspective. They're designed to reinforce each other, to build on activities that were done in earlier grades. We'll talk about that a little bit with sixth grade. And we've got a bunch of different things that the students do with these, from filling in a matrix to tracing out where the Ottomans went, and so on. So that, first of all, you fit each topic with an approach that proved effective for that particular topic, but you're also doing something different day to day. So it's not like, oh, today is just like yesterday again. And you don't have to use all of these, but there's a bunch of stuff here for those to do. And with that, I should try to figure out how I go about getting to oh, should I unshare my screen here, or you're not looking at me again?
We are back to the copyright screen.
Yeah. So I need to get that off. Well, let's do it the brute force way. We'll stop share and start share. This could give people a moment to ask them some questions if they have some.
So interestingly, Phil, I now have the most zoomed in tab on Google ever. There you go. Okay.
So I'm going in the front door of Dave's website about the big ideas clickable launcher. And then when I do that, remember that I showed you some layers from the Europe clickable. The Russia clickable also has expansion of Russia across Asia, which happened during this time frame here. And then there's the Africa clickable. So are we looking at the clickable map here? Just to be sure.
We sure are.
And I go back here and click on the empire capitals. One way to approach the discussion of the African empires is just to put their capital cities up. Now, capital city is a strange word here because they weren't really the capitals. They were kind of the military base for the person who happens to be the ruler of that empire at a particular time. But because of what they were trading, in other words, what was on the trade networks that they had there, and there's a layer on the clickable map that talks about the trade networks. Some of these empires got to be fabulously wealthy. You could make the case that an emperor named Mansa Musa was the world's richest man ever. Because he took a caravan that had tons of gold when he went on his pilgrimage to Mecca a little bit earlier. Now you wonder why he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and Dave's going to be talking about this a little bit later, but you could turn on the religions of this particular time period, and you could see how all of these empire capitals were in fact Islamic. They were the bottom end of the Islamic trading networks. But before you go do that, you just might want to ask a very simple geographic question for your students. The question that's asked on that printed handout sheet that they have. And that is, it's obvious that these empire capitals were not all over Africa. They're in a very definite geographic pattern, and ask the students to describe that pattern in their own words. And some of them are going to say they're all in a line, and some of them are going to say that they're at the same latitude. And what you want to do is you want to get the kids that say those two different things together to realize that the line is at a single latitude, and there might be a reason for that. And then it just becomes an inquiry activity. It's like, what else on this list of information that's on this clickable map might help me understand why all of these capitals are in a line at roughly the same latitude? What was it about that particular part of Africa? And so they can turn on things like, yeah, they were part of the camel trading networks. They had a growing season that was about 3 months long, which turns out to be really good in Africa. You don't want to have it much longer than that. They did not grow cassava to eat because cassava actually is not a crop that you can store for a very long period of time. They did grow millet, and millet is a crop that you can store. And if you have a crop that you can store, particularly if you've invented pottery, where you've got a crop that you can store for a long period of time safely, that gives you a lot of time to do things like form armies, start religions, build things, and so on. We've talked about that before, but that's a part of the story here, is that the empires were based upon a crop that could be grown with a very limited amount of effort and leaving a lot of empty time for the rest of the year that you could use to do other things. That's part of the story, but it is not the whole story. There's another part of the story that's on a button called malaria, that these capitals are just far enough south toward the equator that they get just enough rain. I probably should go over here and make a map of rainy days. You could break that down and you can talk about where rain was in January, if they didn't get any rain in April, and when July comes along and these places get a lot of rain, and then it gets dry again. And dry again turns out to be a really good idea, because when it gets dry again, the mosquitoes die and malaria isn't such a big problem. And every single one of these capitals is in that zone that is just rainy enough to grow a crop of grain or raise some cattle, but not rainy enough to produce a big crop of malaria mosquitoes, trypanosomonas flies, snails, Ebola, a lot of these other African diseases that are in the area that gets a longer rainy season. So there's 4 different ways that you can do this activity. You could do it like I just did it, where you use the clickable map and you kind of demonstrate it. You could do it as an individual inquiry and have them go to the clickable map and then write up their hypothesis of what are the causal relationships that put those African empires in the same place. The linked chapter, when you go back to the menu there, there's a link over to a presentation and to a chapter, and you could use those to present it. But the bottom line is that these capitals were in a very special location with respect to both the ecological relationships. And the simplest way to talk about that is just to turn on the ecoregions here. Then you find out that all of the capitals are right at the margin of the grassland and the savanna with scattered trees around it. But that's the environment where human activity was possible that would lead to very large populations at that time. Now, if I clear that map off, while you're doing this map, you really ought to turn Texas on one time, because that is Texas at its size and its latitude, just to give the students an appreciation for how big Africa is and how silly it is to talk about the culture of Africa when Africa is, 35 times as big as Texas, and Texas thinks it's got 5 or 6 different cultures inside of it. African cultures are complicated, and that is an important part of the foundation for understanding what's going on with the slave trade, with African trade networks, with the spread of Islam, and all of these other things. Let me put up the trade networks one more time, because it lists some of the products: ivory and tin and cola nuts and gold and slaves and salt. Some of these products that were being shipped across from these capitals and Go back, turn the capitals on, you can see each one of these capitals is kind of a node in that trade network. So that's one way to introduce that. And then we can go on to the readings that we've got listed elsewhere in the Giants thing about some of the empires like Mali and Songhai and Ghana and people like Mansa Musa. And even Batuta, even when he was making his travels, he came on one of these caravans and visited Timbuktu and Goa and a couple of these other cities and then crossed path over here. So what we're trying to say with this is that an activity like this can be done just by itself, but it also can be connected to most of the other activities that we're doing in this era, to see that the era had a lot of separate trade networks, but they were linked with each other in ways that were historically important for things like the spread of disease, for the growth of empires, things like that. So with that, I'm going to say I'm done saying what I can say about this. You'll notice that our clickable maps also tend to have satellite images that you can click on and off. And they're all based on a CIA map, which means we can link these clickable maps directly with federal databases, things that you're likely to get from the CIA fact book, and so on. And there's stuff about the colonial era and about languages and so on. I leave this up here and do what Dave said, take 3 or 4 deep breaths here. If anybody had any questions while I still had a clickable map up as a demonstration tool, I'd be happy to answer these questions. And I'm doing that partly so that I can remember how I'm going to be able to get back to, I suppose the safest thing to do is just stop sharing this screen and reshare again. Any thoughts one way or another? Otherwise, we're going to cross the Atlantic Ocean and do the very last lesson in my package. And that's about the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas. And actually about before the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas. Hey, hi, Becky. We'll see you there too.
I had time for 5 deep breaths, Phil. So without any questions popping up in the chat or people unmuting, I think we're ready to board our flight across the ocean.
Okay. With any luck, that's showing on the screen then?
It is. Yep.
Okay, this is the way that the Glicks describe it. The Aztec, the Incas, the Mayas, the early civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. And these are the Glicks that are related to that. One of them is about comparing historical perspectives based on evidence. One is somewhere to use cultural institutions like religion, art, music, so on, to study an era and a region. And then we're supposed to talk about the major achievements from India, China, the Mediterranean, Africa, Southwest, Central Asia, Mesoamerica, and Andean. I don't know what we're going to do on Tuesday, after we finish this off. In other words, this is a completely absurd standard. And we have to figure out how we're going to meet it in an honest way. And then they say examples may include, but are not limited to, and they list a whole bunch of them, and the Aztec, Maya, and Incan empires. And they call them the early civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. And my little built-in crap detector started going off into the purple zone there with 3 great big question marks about the early civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. So let me take you on a tour of some cultural institutions. Now, this is a 65-frame PowerPoint, and it gives me one more chance yet to say all of our PowerPoints are a little bit too long. but you've got a delete key. You can kill it. And I am going to pre-delete a couple of these frames from the one that I'm going to show you right now. And so I've got a 68 frame PowerPoint up here. You only get a 65 frame one. I will challenge you to figure out which ones I'm leaving out. This is an Aztec piece of art from a museum where some museum owner stole it from the Aztecs a long time ago, and no Aztec has complained about it. It's dated reliably to about 1500, which would put it just about the time of Columbus. And it's pretty good art. They've got a very high level of skill in stone carving. Here's a very close-up of a calendar wheel that's about 4 feet in diameter, and you're looking at about 5 inches of it. This is a pretty spectacular piece of work. A small statue of a water deity and another small statue of a woman kneeling. And I don't know how many of you guys have a whole bunch of tools hanging on the back wall like I do, but I'm kind of in awe of the ability to make something like this when you have no iron tools at all, no power tools, just pieces of stone, and you're making art like this. I think that's pretty impressive. And then I'm going to drop the other shoe here. I think it's even more impressive that the Olmecs were making art like this 2,000 years before the Aztecs. And that basically is the story here. The Olmec you might have heard of before. They were the ones that carved enormous heads. They put a couple of people here about person size. This is a head that measures 10.5 feet tall. And that's carved with no metal whatsoever. And you just wonder how somebody could make something like that, and how long ago that was. Now, the Olmec are controversial because this is an Olmec statue, but there's actually a book out there that calls this statue clear proof the Chinese sailors had reached America 3,000 years ago. I will leave it at that, and I will encourage you to delete this from your presentation unless you want to go off into crackpot's conspiracy theories about Chinese invasion of the Western Hemisphere. This one has been called proof that Africans also came to the Americas about the same time. And again, I invite you to delete this if you don't want to go into that. But it is interesting. The Olmec had a very complicated kind of art. Now, we have made a geohistogram that I will use as a marker off in the corner of my presentation here. But Dave sent around a copy of it. This is a very early draft of a geohistogram, but it matches up exactly with your geohistogram for the Eastern Hemisphere. In other words, the dates are, the lines are exactly the same spacing apart. This just goes from the high Andes Mountains down to the coast and then up through Panama and Mexico until it winds up in Alaska, but we haven't finished that part yet. In other words, this is version 1.0, and you want to come back in about 3 months, I'm sure that this geohistogram will be a little bit more elaborate. And the Olmec were one of the very earliest civilizations that were able to leave us something that we could study other than their bones. In other words, the Monaguillo, this group over here in Panama, was actually the very first pottery in the Western Hemisphere. And you know how far they got when the Olmec were starting to make those big heads. So with that, here comes a drink out of a fire hose. This is about the same time as the Olmec in Mexico, but this is in highland Bolivia, the Chaban culture. And they were making pottery like this. This is especially ingenious because this is a pot that actually has 2 spouts up at the top, separated, so that it would bring air in so that when you're pouring it out, it's not burbling out like our milk bottles do. And they had figured out enough about the hydraulics of pottery making to have a pot like that 800 BC. And they're out here in the highlands where the star is on the geohistogram down in the corner there. And if you've got your own copy sitting on the desk, you can do exactly what I would encourage students to do, and that is to mark that pot over there. Meanwhile, in the lowlands of Peru, people were making warrior pots that looked like this 1,000 years before the Inca. And from Teotihuacan in central Mexico, people were making pots that looked like this. Now, that word might actually mean something to you, that Teotihuacan were the ones that were building these huge ceremonial pyramids. And if you remember back, we had a presentation about pyramids. This particular pyramid is about as wide as the biggest pyramid in Egypt. It's only about 2/3 as tall. And remember, this is 1,000 years before the Incas. There are no metal tools, and they're building things of this size, and I have to say, magnificence. And it's pretty impressive. Meanwhile, down on the coast, still 1,000 years before the Incas, there was another culture called the Veracruz, and this is some of their art. So yes, the Aztecs and the Incas were very important people in ancient America, but they were not, repeat, not the early civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. There were a lot of very smart people that were living over here thousands of years earlier before the Aztecs and the Incas. And that really is the point of all this. Now, I'm not taking anything away from the Incas. They built a very impressive network of all-weather roads. They went from the lowland rainforests all the way up to the treeless tundra. But what they were doing was providing a better road for trade networks that had been established by the Hawari people about 1,000 years earlier. The Incas built stone terraces to raise food on steep slopes, but the Paraquet people had built terraces in the lowlands. Inca pottery shows a very high level of skill. This is the same kind of dual entrance pot, and a mastery of pigments and glazes. You might notice that up in the corner, this is from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I basically went out to different museums that I visited, and I got their high definition public domain pictures. So you can make your own set of pictures if you want. The Paracas people that I mentioned earlier, near the coast 2,000 years before, and they were building very elaborate pots with very high level of glaze sophistication, colors, and so on. Those people are best known for their very complicated textile art. The Nazca people came in a different part of the Peruvian coast, and about 700 years later, the little stars showing you where they are over here. They had ceramic that looked an awful lot like the Incas 1,000 years later. They had really kind of creative artists making things out of clay at the time. They just come from a lot of different museums. The Guatemala Maya people, a different part of in the Central America, were making fairly complicated pots 1,000 years before the Incas. People in Costa Rica were making sandstone carved chairs and things like that. The Colima culture on the coast of Mexico, 1,000 years before the Inca, were making a particular kind of red glazed pots. There's about 800 of these still in existence in about 40 different museums. Again, I just kind of marvel at the skill of this. And I'm slowly setting myself up for the picture that's going to pop up about right now that might be one of the ones that, well, first of all, I'm not going to give you this picture. So the version that you're going to have to download won't have it. One of the dangers of having inquiry into Mesoamerican art to be an individual student inquiry is that they had some notions about what was appropriate sexual activity to show in art that doesn't exactly square with what some of our citizen groups in the United States would consider appropriate. And I will leave it at that. you cannot just invite students to go out looking for art by the Kalima or the Paracas people, because the art has a very wide range of subject matter. Like I say, I'll just leave it about there. I'm also trying to figure out if there was actually a live model for this or not, but I have a feeling that there probably wasn't. A few more examples to show you, because one of the things about the Western Hemisphere is that it tended to be a lot of separate independent cultures separated by deserts and things like that. And they were inventing a lot of different ways to do art 1,000 to 2,000 years before the Aztecs and the Incas. So this one's from Colombia, this one's from Panama, and this one's from coastal Mexico. Meanwhile, people were making sophisticated art in North America at the same time. Some of these people were living in these 3-story apartment buildings around circular kivas. A kiva was a kind of a religious ceremonial area in the middle here. And I just brought you about 5 pictures of that real quickly, because archaeologists have rebuilt one of these kivas using information from multiple eyewitness descriptions. And it turns out it just doesn't look like the rock pile that's left after a while. So the next 3 pictures come from the same very small area, which was abandoned about 900 years ago. There's an early kiva. It's made out of river rock, rounded rocks, kind of pasted together with the cement. There's a slightly more recent kiva, about 50 years later, and this one's made out of cut stone. And right next to this, like 500 feet away from the first one that I showed you, is the one that they rebuilt according to the original descriptions. I put these 3 on here for a reason, because what we have to look at these ancient cultures is stuff that has been sitting around for a couple thousand years. And when we look at what's left after centuries of being out in the weather, what we might think we see is primitive people living in a crude rock pile. But if we look at what the descriptions look like, these were some really sophisticated cultures. And they were there in both North and South America long before the Aztec, Inca, and Maya. I'm not taking anything away from the AIMs. I'm just saying they were not the first. And one of the problems that you have with looking at really old ruins like this is that you think that's what it looked like 2,000 years ago. It's just not true. So the Glicks tell you you're supposed to do something that's based on the evidence, and that you're supposed to look at cultural institutions. And the examples may include, but are not limited to. And what I've given you is a PowerPoint of pre-Aztec Inca Maya art in the Western Hemisphere in order to make a couple important points. First of all, that it was very complicated. Second, that it was very sophisticated. And third, that it was very early. And fourth is you can misinterpret an old pot if what you see is a broken old pot or a tumble down ruin. You've got to try to figure out what it actually might have looked like when it was made 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. This is a real tricky balance, to be aware of the complexity, but not overwhelmed with the detail. So I don't know what that balance is for your classroom, and therefore I freely invite you to cut apart that PowerPoint as much as you want. But I give you the PowerPoint that you can do it. Aztec art is quite impressive, but let's keep it in context. Oh, and I gave you 3 more examples from the rest of the world about the same time. One from India, one from China, and one from the West African empires. And then a couple more that I might not put in the version I give you. The same museums had some examples of the high-priced fraud that gets called art today. But those 2 came from the Detroit Museum. And I count me as not really impressed by that when I take a look at what the Paracas people were able to do 3,000 years ago. I just don't much like this. Leave it at that. So with that, you got 7 different empires, 7 different activities that look at them in 7 different ways and make some points. And I will pass it over to a break into Dave, but I'll take my deep breaths while this PowerPoint is still available here in case anybody had a question about it.
Well, that was my 3rd deep breath, Phil, and I didn't see anyone unmute. So, although Sarah put in the chat, when we studied cave paintings, one of my kiddos made a meme, art and prehistory with cave paintings, and art in 2019 over the picture of the banana duct taped to the wall that was called, oh yeah, the banana that was duct taped to the wall. Do you remember that one, when that circled around as quote unquote art?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I actually put together a collection of old petroglyphs too, because this is something that was done both in the Western and Eastern Hemisphere. And we're trying to connect petroglyphs with the chariot story. You know, we told you back in era 2, because the petroglyphs for chariot are identical in China and the Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine is basically where the chariot was invented by the steppe people who lived in Ukraine, what we now call Ukraine. And then they sold it to the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and the Chinese in exchange for products that they could get there. And one of the ways that you can document that is through the petroglyphs. People who lived on the steppes did not have a written language, but they left all kinds of rock carvings around. So if people think that it would be worthwhile to put that together into a PowerPoint, kind of like the one that I just showed you about Aztec, Inca, and Maya, let me know, and maybe sometime this summer we'll try to put that together for you. And then the other thing is, if you've got any other suggestions for what Dave and I both think is still the garbage can called the Era 4, let us know if you've got any ideas as to how we can make this a little bit more digestible for you. You know, we're trying to put together these little half period and 1 period activities that can bring together some of the ideas that are on the clips.
Well, it is 5:49. I think this is a good time for our 15-minute break. So why don't we adjourn and come back at, I guess that would be 6:04. If my math holds correctly, I am an English and social studies consultant, not a math consultant, but I believe that's about right. So why don't we mute and we'll come back and delve further into Unit 6 and the assessment, and then Unit 7, 6:04. So Becky, you weren't here when we first started today, so I skipped all of the general announcement piece. As we come back from break, what should participants know about things like sketches and next steps and all of those fun orders of business?
Well, if I'm remembering correctly, Dave, we have the sketch application form along with all of the other materials, right, in the same section. So if people wanted SCECHs, I know that some folks had completed the form previously, but if folks haven't had the chance to do that, I would suggest printing off a copy of this and filling it out, and then scanning it to Mandy, who is our sketch coordinator. I have already done the agendas, and I believe everything else that Mandy needs for us to receive those SCECHs. And Dave, as far as attendance, I think we can do that off of the chat from each of the meetings, correct?
I believe I've been sending her these Zoom logs, which show in out time. In some cases, if you get disconnected frequently, like I used to before my internet switched, it may have multiple in and out times, but I believe we've been using the Zoom logs for that.
Yep. Okay. So she should be able to verify attendance with that. And I think we should be good to go. So I guess what would be helpful, if folks still want SCECHs and have not completed the form, if we could have folks do that within the next week, I think that would be terrific.
Gotcha. All right.
And can I'm going to answer Sarah's chat question. It doesn't matter where you teach to get SCECHs, as long as we have the form with your PIC number. That's all we need.
Yep. And so if you weren't, if you were looking for where to find that form, it's up on my screen right now. It's in the agendas. We've kept it in the agenda document right at the top with each one of those, along with the Zoom link and how to access the 7th grade assessment folder and all of that fun stuff. This Google Doc is not going to go away. So you'll always have access to this, which has all of those old agendas and the like. I think the thing you'll probably want the most is that 7th grade assessment folder. But yeah, no, this link will not go away. Although if any of you teach double duty 7th grade and 3rd grade, which would be the oddest teacher combination ever, but you know, in Northern Michigan, we see all sorts of weird combinations like that. Next year, we'll be doing what we did this year with 7th grade. I believe we're going to target for 3rd to do another rollout of the 3rd grade units. So if there's a 3rd grade teacher in your life, next year would be a great year for them to jump on board. And we usually send out to everyone we've ever met, you know, the notice that registration is open when that opens up in the fall. So to be continued, and stay tuned. Our time together may be drawing to a close, but if there are some 3rd grade teachers in your life that could benefit from a year of fill, and 2 very exuberant and wonderful 3rd grade teachers who helped design that curriculum, you know, they will be taking the reins next year, and we'll all be better for it. So all right, so we are at, I'm going to sort of close down Unit 6 by highlighting a couple of different activities that are located in Unit 6, as well as the assessment. And then I'm going to go over the crazy conundrum that is Unit 7. And then we'll wrap up. And like I said, if that is early, so be it. If it is right on time, so be it, but it will not be late. So as far as Unit 6 goes, aside from some of the stuff that Phil brought up, there is a really cool in lesson 1, because our standard that we centered lesson 1 around was that crisis in the capital or classical world, which really hits in on, you know, should we say the European perspective, so to speak, that whole chunk of the world. And one of the things that we thought we would bring into this, there was a really, really, really cool C3 teachers inquiry on the Black Death. Now, I did a lot with my teacher groups when the C3 teachers website first rolled out. I did a lot with this inquiry in particular because it was interesting. It was, you know, it was gripping. The sources were gripping. And when I modeled some C3 inquiries in classrooms around my zone, I tended to go to this one because the kids ended up really, really liking it. This was published now in like 2015, 2016, I think. So it predated the, you know, before the COVID-19 virus was even a single-celled organism in the eye of, two other single-celled organisms. This one was there well before it. And I think it's even more relevant now, which is why I wove it into Unit 6, because this is a really great opportunity to have a more in-depth targeted conversation about disease and how it can impact the world. So right off the bat, I love this compelling question: can disease change the world? Because it is student friendly, it is arguable as it's supposed to be, and you can argue multiple perspectives. But I always I argue with colleagues all the time about making it as, like a haiku, the fewest number of words possible to get that good, compelling question out that also sparks a kid's interest. And I think even pre-pandemic, I know that this was a question that sparked kids' interest right off the bat. And I think now it would also spark interest just for a different way. And then the supporting questions that go along with this: what was the Black Death? How did the Black Death spread so quickly? How did the Black Death affect people in the 14th century? And what I like about this is right off the bat, when you pull open a C3 inquiry, you generally have a staging the question component to it. And this is, your opportunity to sort of launch the inquiry and get kids thinking about where they're going to go. And here, right off the bat, you have discuss an example of a recent outbreak of infectious disease and how public officials responded to the outbreak. This is another one where it's far more meaningful in the year of our Lord 2022 than it was when I was doing this with, sixth graders and seventh graders, in places like Ludington and Alpena and elsewhere. Because what we really had, the two that kids kept coming back to as the most prominent ones that they could think of, you had some that remembered the Zika outbreak, and then you had some that remembered, the Ebola outbreak. And so we had some limited conversations about both of those, where I felt like the miracle worker going, yes, good, tell me more. And now I think, every sixth grader or seventh grader out there has joined the rest of the adults out there as, infectious disease experts who can tell you exactly how public health officials responded to an outbreak pretty clearly, because they've all now lived through one for a while. So, and then the other part of this that I want to bring your attention to is down in the taking informed action piece, keeping in mind, again, this was written in 2016, possibly, somewhere-ish around there. The taking informed action part of an inquiry are the things you can do above and beyond that summative performance task that really try to make everything sing, that try to make, kids realize that even with something at the I'm taking action to be informed level, there are things that they can do. So find current examples of how we prevent, detect, and minimize the spread of diseases in homes and schools and communities. Again, cannot make this up. This was written several years before this global pandemic. And I think if they want to understand, how we prevent, detect, and minimize the spread, if they want more, you could always invite your building principal in to be a guest speaker on how they do things like contact tracing, and the whole family can get involved in the taking informed action component of this inquiry. So I love all of this, and then think of at least one way we might improve the prevention or control of the spread of diseases in homes and schools and communities. Again, we're all experts on this now. And then finally, create a public service for improved methods of prevention, detection, and control. So I see Monica's question there. I'll get to that in just a sec, but I am highlighting this Black Death inquiry from the New York Toolkit because it is relevant in all sorts of ways now. I think that even more than when I was making the rounds with this a few years back, I think this is definitely a inquiry worth pausing and going just a little bit deeper for. So Monica asks, my students and I have talked about eras and how a major change has to happen to trigger a new era. What does everyone think about a new era due to COVID? I've told the kids they might be part of the process of moving into one. That is a great question. That's a great inquiry question to discuss with your kids. That's a great question to discuss as a group. So let's pause there for a second, because part of a good inquiry is that it sparks other inquiry questions. What do you guys think? Are we at the process of moving into a new era? Hopefully what we can call a post-COVID era, but do you think we're on the cusp of that? Anybody want to weigh in? I could force my co-presenters to weigh in. Phil, Becky, do you want to weigh in? What do you think?
I'm going to vote for Ukraine being a more likely trigger for a new era.
Interesting. And Becky's nodding. Either of you want to say more on that? I love it. I've given this exactly zero thought, and I'm putting the onus of answering it on the two of you. So that's
Okay. Well, I think this is, and Dave, you're going to laugh. Okay. I think this is one of those, not this inquiry, but as Phil shifted the thinking toward Ukraine, I think this is one of those times when it becomes really beneficial to be teaching using the themes of history. Because if our students are not seeing parallels right now with what is happening in Ukraine to previous periods of history and some of the same overarching themes that are driving this action, then that's an even bigger problem. So that's just my 2 cents. You know how much I love teaching using the themes.
I do, which is why I took a drink. It's the other thing, like skills and concepts, that requires a beverage in hand. So Phil, anything you want to add to that? I was hoping we could get like a talking heads thing going here where, I'm the moderator and I have two guests with two completely different viewpoints, but sounds like you're both sort of in agreement on the concept there. So.
Well, I think we need different heads to be doing the talking too.
Teachers
I see Monica's head grinning at me saying she's about ready to say something.
The argument in my classroom was just that the way of life changed so dramatically that we went from being out and about in really a global civilization to being such an isolated single family units. And you couldn't go outside of your house without wearing your mask and all that. So that was the argument that my students had.
It's a good argument, and that is where I would expect a, they're 11, 12 roughly age wise, that would be, I think, an argument I would expect them to go for first over something like the Ukraine. But now, you then also have the counterpoint of, okay, so is it COVID, or is it the Ukraine, or is it something else, or is it a combination of this, that, and the other? And that again leads to some really rich conversations you can have with your kiddos, that makes you feel like, you hit a home run with ancient world history instruction that day. So.
Yeah, my Ukraine vote was less about military or geopolitics and more about trade. But what it did was it sharply reversed centuries of increasing trade toward supply chain problems. Now, some of that was due to COVID, but a lot of it was due to geopolitics. I think we're in for a time with people behaving more like turtles and less like octopuses, if I could go back to that comparison, that the Ottomans were trying to connect the world and the Mughals were trying to isolate themselves from it. It's kind of like what happened at the end of the Ming Dynasty in China. But I think this reversal of trade is going to stick around for quite a while here. We're going to try to build more, buy American and all of this other words like that. And that makes us more separate, more willing to fight rather than to negotiate.
Any last thoughts before moving on from anybody?
Just comparing to the 6th grade units, which really talk about globalization, and then a recent trend of some reverse globalization or a cutting off.
Well, and you have the most recent argument made by folks at The Economist that we are beyond globalization, that it is no longer the theme of the day as far as the way that our societies interact. And so that's also another question that's up for debate.
I threw it to be snarky in the chat, but what is beyond globalization? Galacticization or solar systemization? Or...
Yes, absolutely.
I was thinking the same, because while you can't really undo globalization, you can move to being more separate, but I feel like there's no way to undo it.
Another good, so again, a good inquiry leads to other inquiry questions that leads to this never-ending rabbit hole. And we could probably stay here all night. Monica looks like she turned her camera back on to say something else, so I'll let her get another word in. But oh, she did the global wave. Okay.
No,
so
I didn't.
These are great questions, and you know, I hope that you have I hope that you guys have you know, as much fun with this as I did when I took this one through the rounds. Now, I did want to point out in the lessons proper where this pops up, and I have way too many. I am usually a 2-3 tabs person tops. And I have about 20 tabs open because I've got to at some point talk about every one of these tabs. But I can say that there is more in here than you know, you might have time for. And if that ends up being the case, goodness gracious, it's back in lesson 1. Okay, that ends up being the case. You've got 2 ways to slice it. You can do the whole thing overall as it's presented, or I went through and I created a modified source pack. So with the modified source pack, it's again the same inquiry question, the same supporting questions, but fewer sources. So if you are feeling the crunch of time, but you don't want to let this particular one go, I took what I felt like were the most relevant sources based from the times that I had done this with kids myself. I took the most relevant sources and put them in one spot. So you can use the questions and ignore the sources in the main one and just use the modified source pack. Either one is completely up to you. But if you're looking for a way to save a little bit of time, you know, go ahead and use the modified source pack. So in terms of other things that I wanted to highlight from Unit 6, we have some, you know, we have some stuff. We move into the Renaissance. So when Phil and I sat down and we looked at these glicks and we looked at the other glicks that we hadn't hit yet, we both kind of made this sound. We were like, and the purpose behind that sound is if you actually look at these content expectations, it's moved from some very specific things. You know, earlier in the course, we had a content expectation on the agricultural revolution. And now it's very broad, generalized statements that overall, you know, are not super helpful, like we pointed out when you're trying to sit down and plan a course. So what I did was, you know, and Becky's gotten 1,000 of these questions too. When people open up a standards document and they see your name in it, they don't look at the parts that you contributed to. They ask you questions about the document overall. In fact, Becky, it's probably a testament to how well you and I did leading the US history team that I have gotten maybe a handful of US history based questions. But the questions that I get the most are, I get high school world history teachers saying, okay, I did a keyword search. The word Renaissance doesn't appear anywhere in the document. The Reformation doesn't appear anywhere in this document. None of these things that I'm expecting to see appear in 7th grade or in high school. So where are they? And I can say that my general answer to them is, well, you don't need a keyword search to know what historical era the Renaissance takes place in. And that tides them over for about 5 minutes before they go, okay, but that time period appears in 7th grade and it appears in high school. So where do I do it? So I use this as an opportunity to right some of those wrongs. And so we've got some stuff in here on the Renaissance. We've got some stuff on some of those pieces that people are like, well, where is it? Where is it? I can't find it. So that is in here, and I just lost the sheet again. I am batting 1,000 here. I guess the part that I can highlight without bringing it up, I believe it's in lesson 1. We've got some stuff on the Renaissance because that seems to be the thing that most people are looking for some sign of somewhere. But I tackled it in an interesting way. What's great about our line of work is that we're constantly reading and constantly attending new things. And I was racking my brain for what a good culminating activity for the Renaissance piece could be. And all of a sudden, I read about 12 different articles about teachers using the pandemic as an opportunity, the distance learning component is an opportunity to have kids try their hand in podcasting. So after reading all these articles, I thought, you know what? Hey, how about we have to kick off the short burst of activities that we have on the Renaissance itself, how about we have kids research a famous Renaissance inventor or painter or person from that era, and let's have them in partner groups. Let's have them do a short podcast where they actually interview one of these people. So you get a little bit of speaking and listening in there. If I go to the 612 literacy essentials and we talk about good practices in getting kids opportunities to do some speaking and listening based activities in classroom. We built this sort of culminating activity for the Renaissance around a podcast. One thing I did not put in the lesson plans are how to actually go about doing that. There's a variety of ways. The simplest is to do something like a Google Hangout and just have it be a Google Hangout that's recorded. If you've got 2 Chromebooks, that's recorded between the 2 Chromebooks, even if they're in the same room, or if you put one in the hallway and one in the same room. You can also, if you've got a active computer lab in your classroom, there's all sorts of tools like Audacity that's free that you can download. You can do it if you've got iPads via the GarageBand app, which is, free and preloaded on all iPhones and iPods and everythings that are out there. But you can even just go as simple as have kids open up, a 2-way communication via Google Meet and record it that way. But the podcast project is a fun one in there that I hope that your kids end up enjoying. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight from Unit 6, if I can find it, if I go over to, I'm just going to open it again, to lesson 3, is I guess it would be lesson 2 when we're back in the Americas. The last thing I wanted to highlight is another lesson learned, so to speak, that Becky and I have had due to some of our work with some of the tribes in Michigan. So when Michigan Open Book Project came out, and we ended up getting a lot of help from the tribes after our first release, we'd had a map in the book that sort of listed the geographic locations for a lot of the tribes. And as we learned more and worked with some folks like Eric Hemingway and others, we recognized that map was a terrible map because it wasn't really representative of, geography is a relative term when it comes to, how far and wide some of the tribes in the United States in particular roamed. So, I have a couple of different activities that are cute little spins on that. Not cute in a cute way, but I have some activities that get kids thinking along those lines. So this is the original problematic map. And we were super proud of ourselves for having this map in there. And it didn't take long for Eric Hemingway to sit down and point out to me, you know, in 30 seconds, here are 12 things wrong with this map in 30 seconds. You give me an hour, I can give you 175,000 things that are wrong with this map. But here are 12 things wrong with this map right away. And I see this map pop up on social media every now and then as like, what if we learned US history this way? And what I always want to comment, but I don't, is that if we'd learned US history this way, we would also be learning it wrong. So I include this map as part of the discussion piece, but then we also have this great NPR piece that came out. And one of the assessment questions tackles this too. So here is another attempt at trying to geographically represent some of the tribes and the problems. And this article goes a little more in depth into some of the problems with trying to adequately place where some of these groups were. And one of the major differences is the number. So this one is in some cases a little bit better, but it's a much larger, not like even look at California, if I zoom in, you know, and that is not what is depicted on this map. You know, so it's a great opportunity for kids to kind of learn a little bit more about this debate, since we have that that content expectation that basically goes back to every little thing that happened in North America up to 1500 CE. So that's one of the ways that we tackle that in there. And then there's I think it's a pretty cool assessment question that we've embedded on the assessment that comes along from these two activities. So that is the last thing I wanted to say about Unit 6 overall. There are still some other things that we haven't highlighted, but our hopes are that they will be pretty self-explanatory. Any questions or last minute things? I see Becky threw something in the chat. Any questions over this? Or Becky, did you want to talk a little bit more about what you threw into the chat?
Not really.
Okay.
I'm just going to let the economist in the video do the speaking.
Gotcha. All right. Well, let me really quickly here go over what we have for the Unit 6 assessment. So many tabs open. This, those of you who know me well know that when I get beyond 4 tabs open in my browser, I start to have panic attacks. So the fact that I've got like close to 20 up there right now is, I'm just not going to look at it. I'm just going to keep my gaze below that portion here. So the Unit 6 assessment is in the same assessment folder that you will have found all of the others, and it's linked there. And it's still a little bit of a work in progress. But you can see that we've got these same item types that we've had popping up on previous assessments. We are trying to focus them in again on some of the bigger ideas. And as such, this one has about 15 questions total for a, 1 second, please. Sorry, the children are back from dance class. So yes, the reason why I sort of left this one at a shorter one is because there is a ton of alternative assessment types coming up in Unit 7. And we don't really want to draw a huge dividing line between Unit 6 and Unit 7 and what you do in those two. So you know, we hit some of the major plot points of the unit overall. This is the question that you know, I grappled with for a while that I may still do a little bit of tweaking on, but ultimately, how might a geography use this map of Indigenous peoples, language regions differently from a historian? I'm interested in what kids would come up with for their answers to that based off of you know, that particular activity. And Phil and I, a couple of summers ago, when we were working on getting all of his clickable maps updated and on that portal, ended up, you know, Phil ended up creating a new type of clickable that I'm sure there's about 3,000 of ready for me to start building. They're actually clickable graphs as opposed to clickable maps. And I wove in some stuff in the units on this particular clickable graph. And I wanted to test my hand at building some assessment questions that go along with it as well. So Pretty standard fare. If you've been using the assessments thus far, there are no big surprises on this one. We don't introduce a brand new item type that you've never seen before and never done before. Overall, it is just weighing in at just at 15 questions with a slightly larger focus this time around on extended response versus just multiple choice and drag and drop. So it was the nature of the beast of this particular unit. Any questions on the Unit 6 assessment? Hearing none, that is one tab that I will be able to get rid of here. So let's talk for a little bit about Unit 7. Unit 7 is the final unit in the 7th grade Giants curriculum. It is the capstone in a lot of ways, and it is also the unit where Phil and I went, okay, so we never talked about this, or we talked about this as an optional activity, but now we really think this should be a full-blown activity. So if they, we need to highlight this thing again, and it's a review if they didn't do it, or it's a, okay, now do it if they did do it before. So if that made any sense to you whatsoever, then it is not 6:36 on a Wednesday, wherever you are right now. But Unit 7 is odd, and it was odd in its original form, and it's odd in this form too. So we have a grouping of geography standards that came in literally 20 minutes before the final draft was due to MDE. And these geography standards are all sort of covered already in your, in the earlier units. We tried to do that because we did not want, to have to come back and do like a superfluous geography unit. In my mind, 8 years from now, when we open up the content standards to revise them again, these are the first 12 that I'm recommending we just axe completely, because they were added at the last minute without any discussion from the whole group. And most of it is already covered in the history-based standards. They don't add anything beneficial or useful outside of they add some confusion when people are going through and trying to audit a course, and they're like, well, wait, what about these 12 content standards at the end? How come you don't have individual lessons on any of those? We do. They're actually embedded all into the history, which is where they were meant to be. But the thing that we did not embed into the history is every grade level has, the P's, the public inquiry and discourse, the decision making, the persuasive communication about a public issue. And I love these for a lot of reasons. I hate them in the integrated history courses because they are never integrated into the history. These always, to me, in 7th grade and in 8th grade in particular, but even so in 5th grade, where you've got a course that has a theme and then this thing comes out of nowhere, these always to me seem tacked on in a way that, I know as a standards writer, we didn't mean to have them feel tacked on, but any attempts to change them were met with like overwhelming resistance from the old school members of the group that were there last time, that something must have gone down in the writing of the 2007 standards for an otherwise rational group of people to say there will be no changes to these standards. So I like the overall message that these standards send. I just don't like the execution. And try as we might, we were unable to change the execution. So part of Unit 7 is a capstone to the course overall, where we ask you to really have some conversations with your kids about what legacies from the ancient world are still impacting us today, which I think is a great doorway into these P questions, and then these P standards, and then how we ended up tackling the P standards as part of the unit. So lots of bigger capstone-y type assessment for this one. And I pull that out only because I'm going to take a small tour through earlier units to show you how we get to that point of the legacy of the ancient world. So some of the things that I wanted to share, again, Becky already brought up, because I wanted to return to the themes of history, because when you get into Unit 7, It is a great place to revisit those themes of history in a way that you might not have in some of the previous units. And it's not even necessarily spelled out in the step-by-step documents, but you start off Unit 7 with a gallery walk. And this gallery walk talks about what a legacy is. And so you would print all of these off and you would have them positioned around the room, and you'd have small groups go through and kind of read and take in at each one of these stations. And then that would lead into a larger conversation about what are some of the most impactful pieces from the ancient world that still hit us today. So you can talk about, in Rome, government, and talk about parallels to our own. Other parts of Europe, like the trial by jury, personal rights, personal property, inheritance, language. We have English, and English includes all these, strays from other languages as well as part of it. So kids would basically go through in small groups and take a look in this gallery walk around the classroom, or include the hallway too if you want, because there's quite a few in here. And this sort of launches into the conversation about which of these things really still impacts us today. And there's more than one answer, because every single one of these gallery walk stations has another thing that you can, bring to the equation of, well, no, this is the most important thing that came from that ancient world. We're really trying to connect that ancient history that they've studied all year to today in some ways, and show them how, why it's important that we study, why it's important that we've studied all of this. And so it might be a good idea to go back and take a look at those themes of history again too, because once you've looked at these specific things, you can say, now, how have these themes been impacted throughout the years as well? Becky, these are one of your favorite things in the world. Am I doing your themes of history justice with this? Is there anything you want to add, or things that I might not have added in the moment about how you could use the themes with this sort of gallery walk activity?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. Just that that is one of the activities that I will periodically do with students, so that no matter which time period or unit of instruction we happen to be in, we're constantly going back to those themes. So sometimes it's through artifacts, sometimes it's through a series of events, or even new ideas, and kind of tracing it back that way. So I think that there are a lot of different types of activities that you can do to get your students thinking thematically, and then also being able to justify their number one choice, and also using like the spec strategy to help them structure their thought processes as they want to speak about why they think it might be theme 4, conflict and cooperation, for example.
So it's funny you bring up the spec strategy, because on my screen right now is the spec strategy. So this is one, you're going to see, this is, you know how your favorite artists, when they've been around for a while, they'll release a greatest hits album, and that greatest hits album has, all of their greatest hits on it, but there's usually like 3 or 4, or sometimes if it's a long album, 5 additional new songs that you haven't heard before, as another way to entice you to buy the album. Unit 7 is the 7th grade Giants greatest hits album. And so with some of the new stuff that's out there, with some of the old stuff that's out there, this is the exact same G-spec chart that popped up in Unit 4 of the Giants units. And we revisited it again here with some additional links in here, because a optional activity that you could have kids do with this legacies piece is assign kids a group, get kids into a group, and one group's going to look at Rome, and they're going to be able to look at all of this through that G-spec lens, and then say, after all of this research, we've decided Rome's greatest contribution to the modern world is this, and here's why. So this is one of the new songs on our 7th grade Giants Greatest Hits album. It's really a remix, so sometimes those greatest hits albums have a remix. Go for it, Bex. I saw you do the universal
Sorry.
thing for just one more thing. Go for it.
Sorry, I know, I'm sorry. But again, reinforcing what you are saying, Dave, I love the spec strategy here, particularly because we often will talk with students about, or get them to answer your question, what's the one greatest thing that came from the Greek civilizations, right? And 9 times out of 10, they address democracy, but then what gets kind of lost in the mix are other really cool things like architecture. And so if we use the spec strategy, I think it kind of helps ensure that some of those other pieces that might not be quite as significant don't get lost.
Absolutely. I think more than a greatest hits album, we should call Now That's What I Call Giants. You remember the Now That's What I Call Music series? Now That's What I Call Giants. And G-Spec is definitely a major part of Now That's What I Call Giants Volume 7, 7th grade. So, yep. All right. A couple of other optional activities to go along with it. There is a Legacies board game that they can play. This came from the original authors. I just left it in there verbatim because I felt it was another good, if you've got time for it, great. If you don't, there we go too. And yes, Becky, I think with a little more funding, you could probably get the Goo Goo Dolls to record something for Now That's What I Call Giants. So there's your call out. And then we've got stuff that again appeared in previous units. They're appearing again here either as review or as I didn't do it in the previous unit, so maybe here's another opportunity to do it. And poof, that takes us to the end of the very first lesson where we're really hitting home those legacies of the ancient world. And you've got several different ways that you can have kids present out and use that as the assessment as kind of a capstone of the course overall. Here are some of the big things that I learned from the course. Moving into the second part, this is again another review style thing where we do get into the fall of the Ming Dynasty here. This is I do not believe this appeared anywhere else in the Giants units prior to this, although Phil can correct me if I'm wrong here. But
well, it's just right out at the edge of the time frame. So there are a lot of high school teachers use that one now.
Gotcha.
And we might just move it off to the high school unit, except it kind of brings the era to an end. It's like with the collapse of the Ming, lots of things happened.
Which, if I'm remembering our conversations last spring when we were finalizing these units, I think that's why we left this one in here, because again, it's an optional activity, but it does sort of provide that other end of the bookend for the course. So let's see. We get more into, now we talked about this again in our fall of empires unit here, but we had some conversations about democracy, the republics, Rome versus US, what that look. Again, these are reviews from previous units. These are things to bring back up or do with your kids if you didn't do them in the previous unit. And then as far as some newer stuff that we haven't done, if you want to delve a little bit further into, because we have some C standards, we have some standalone government standards that again are sort of integrated, but people may be looking for those specific pieces. Again, here again, some optional activities that get you into this. And finally, for unit 7, let's see, I actually closed the tab that I needed. The final thing in Unit 7 is a final performance task that really covers the public inquiry and discourse standards. Now, it is written out here in a semi-friendly teacher format, but if you want, like, if you think of this like a performance task, if you remember back when they started, rolling out all the next generation assessments, and every kid in every grade level was going to do a performance task until they realized how much work that was, and then they backed off of it. And I don't even know what grade levels they're doing performance tasks in, if any at all anymore. But if these are the teacher directions and you want a student friendly look at what all of this looks like, way better than what you see here, I'm going to turn your attention now to the Michigan Open Book Project. And if you click on the Get a Copy tab and you scroll down to 7th grade and you pull open chapter 8, guess what? Here's your beautiful student-friendly student text or test booklet, basically, for going through and doing this final performance task. Now, this performance task is not going to be, if you can make it centered on the ancient world, more power to you. That is not how the standards are written. It's very much the typical public problem, identify, solve the problem, go through that. That's how that last 7th grade standard chunk is written. So you can go either way with this, but this is your student-friendly student booklet guiding students or groups of students through this project. Now, what I really like about this is Amy Striegel, who is one of Becky's teachers from the West Side, wrote this chapter for Open Book, and she wrote this part of the lesson. I changed nothing because Amy is really good at scaffolding things down for kids in a step-by-step format that they just seem to naturally get. So really, I did no work on this lesson. I just left it. Oh, one sec, I'm getting my connection is unstable. There we go, it's gone. I did no major revision work to this because it was an Amy thing and it was already pretty clear, especially if you pull open the open book piece, go through and do this. Here's some vocabulary to help get you started. Here's a way to get inspired. Here are your step-by-step, here's what you do. If you follow this as with your students alongside of the lesson 3 giants piece, you've got everything you need to teach this performance task really well with your kids. And what I really like is if you go to the very end of this, Amy even has samples of what her kids have done, and you can delve into some of those examples and samples, and gives you an idea of what they've done. So those are available both in the lesson plan and overall throughout the student booklet, so to speak, that's available for you with Open Books. So really like this. It very succinctly and very well, there's Amy from Hamilton, very well put together way of closing off the course, not in a world history format, but just in general. But there are plenty of things going on in the world. Like right now, this would be a great time to lead the kids through this activity on ways that they could help the Ukraine. It's just one thing that pops into my head right now as a current event that has roots in history that is a great way to put into practice these public inquiry and discourse standards. So just know that this is your student test booklet that walks them through. And it's not quite as pretty when it's presented this way for you in the Giants template. But between the two, you've got everything you need to do this and do this well with your students. And you've got Amy Striegel from Hamilton to thank for it, because it needed no revision work outside of, I've got revision work right here. I'm going to assign myself the task of making sure that this has the right standards in it when you get to teaching this, because this is not the right standard set. So
speaking of standards,
and assign, go for it, Phil.
I'm just going to put a request out for people. When I read over the geography standards, they've described them accurately. They were dumped into the standards at the last minute with no discussion and voted on. I have no
No,
idea.
they weren't even voted on, Phil. They were not even voted on.
Yeah, I have no idea who wrote them, where they came from. They are not in any way the kind of standards that I would write. So I pretty much have said, yes, I'm confident that we have covered these all, but I haven't gone out of my way to mark down exactly which lesson does which one of these. If you need that kind of document, let me know, because I do have a little window of time in April where I could sit down and go through it, make a little, 1 or 2 page matrix of standards on one column and then lessons across the top and kind of show how we hit each one of those. I'm actually hoping that it's sort of obvious in the way the lessons have been designed that we did try to do, identifying the factors that contribute to conflict and cooperation. Showed up in about 3 different ones, the Vikings today and so on, and then describe examples of how humans modified the environment showed up in a couple of them. In other words, I'm hoping that it's obvious that we have done these, but we haven't gone out of our way to list them because, like Dave said, they kind of duplicate some of the history standards and it just made things more cluttered. Does that make sense? So write me in the chat if you actually need a document like that. We'll put it on the agenda to make one. Otherwise, I would just as soon do something more interesting.
Well, I'm always willing to tell the quick ballad of how they got there, but as the guy who was putting the final draft together for MDE, because as Becky can tell you, MDE butchered the first draft of the standards so badly that we were all like, okay, I know they're your standards, but you're not allowed to do that again. So as the only other one with massive amounts of Adobe InDesign experience, it fell to me. And literally it was due at noon on Friday, or it wasn't going to make it to the State Board of Education and we would never have had new standards. I was waiting on the civic standards the night before, and literally 11:59 the night before, I got an email from the head of the 6th and 7th grade team that said, add these standards. There was no vote. There was nothing I could do, because if they didn't go and they were supposed to be there, we would have one problem. And if they did go, or if they weren't supposed to be there and did go, we'd have another. I just went with what I was told, and poof, we have these extra standards. But I concur 100% with what Phil said. It's in the other stuff, and there's more important work out there to do than just those. So,
and Dave and I are working on a book about the entire 6-year process. It'll be a real page turner.
Yep. It would surprise you all to know that despite having a bunch of educators on the panel to write them, very little of some of the stupid stuff that's in our standards had anything to do with education. There's a group of 4th grade standards that exist solely because the Michigan Historical Society didn't want to change their field trip. These standards appeared out of the ether. It's 11:59 the night before they were due. Like, there's a lot of really, like, if you want to stay on for an additional hour after we're done, we have stories we can tell. But I also think we should keep this focused on 7th grade and close that off. But I don't have anything else. That is Unit 7 in a nutshell. So with what we rolled out tonight, that is now a complete set, a year's worth. I'll pull up in that pacing view one more time, but that is a year's worth of units available to you. And we hope that you find them valuable. It's a great place to start. And we hope that you take them and do even cooler things with them. So what questions might you have for any of us over anything we've covered tonight or any other night? Now Phil's doing the universal signal for but one more thing. Go for it, Phil.
And one very tiny more thing, lest anybody feel, like Michigan is being singled out like this. I was asked to review the standards in another state about 4 months ago. And I showed a couple of them to Dave and Becky. They will back me up when I say thank heavens we have the Michigan standards that we have. They are so much better than this other state. It is unbelievable. So we've described them in kind of negative terms for part of it, but they're pretty good by comparison.
They're our children. We worked on them. We can disparage them, because we raised them. We raised them from sentence fragments into what you have before you today. All right. Becky, any last words?
Love, peace, and chicken grease. We're out of here.
Well,
Send
gang, I will wish
send us an
you what-
email for what you want us to fix.
Yep. And I will wish you what I've been wishing all of my teacher groups going forward. I hope you have a very boring rest of the school year. I hope that we are no longer living through unprecedented times, but really, I just hope that the rest of your school year is successful and uneventful. So you guys have a great rest of your year and reach out to any of us if you need us.